The job posting on Craigslist was almost too good to be true. Night security guard, 4 nights a week, 12-hour shifts, $22 an hour. No experience required, just a clean background check and the ability to work alone. After 8 months of unemployment and my savings account hitting double digits, I wasn't in a position to be picky. I responded within minutes. The interview took place in a small office building downtown, nothing fancy. The man who hired me introduced himself as Mr. Davidson, Regional Property Manager for Sunset Properties, LLC. He was thin, probably in his 50s, with tired eyes and a handshake that felt like he'd rather be anywhere else. "The position is straightforward," he explained, sliding a manila folder across his desk. "Eastgate Shopping Center. Been closed for 3 years now, but we're required to maintain security presence for insurance purposes. Simple patrol schedule, incident reporting, basic stuff." I opened the folder and found a floor plan of a mall I vaguely remembered from childhood. 2 anchor stores, JCPenney and Sears, with about 40 smaller shops arranged around a central concourse. The food court occupied the entire west wing, with 8 different restaurants surrounding a common seating area. "Why did it close?" I asked, studying the layout. Davidson shrugged. "Same story everywhere. Online shopping, big box stores, changing demographics. The last anchor store pulled out in 2019 and that was it. We've been trying to find a buyer or redevelop, but..." He gestured vaguely. "Commercial real estate isn't what it used to be. The pay was legitimate, benefits after 90 days. The only catch was the isolation. I'd be completely alone from 10 p.m. to 10 a.m., 4 nights a week. Given my recent track record with unemployment and social anxiety, that actually sounded like a feature rather than a bug. "When can I start?" I asked. "Tonight, if you're ready. Training shift with our current guard, then you're on your own." I signed the paperwork and drove home to grab my thermos and some snacks. For the first time in months, I felt something like optimism. 22 an hour was better than anything else I'd found, and watching empty hallways couldn't be that complicated. Eastgate Shopping Center sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a sea of cracked asphalt that had once accommodated hundreds of cars. Now, it was empty except for weeds pushing through the pavement and the occasional abandoned shopping cart. The building itself was massive, a sprawling single-story structure with a partial second level over the food court. Most of the exterior lights were dark, but security floods illuminated the main entrances. The guard I was replacing met me at the employee entrance near what used to be the Sears. His name was Carl, a heavy-set guy in his 60s who looked like he'd been doing this kind of work for decades. "Easiest job you'll ever have," he said, leading me through a maze of service corridors to the security office. "Just stay awake and walk the building every hour. Most excitement you'll see is teenagers trying to break into smoke weed." The security office was located in the center of the mall, accessible through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" near the old Spencer's. Inside was a bank of monitors, showing feeds from 36 cameras throughout the building, a radio system, a small desk, and a mini fridge that hummed loudly in the corner. "Cameras cover all the main areas," Carl explained, pointing to the screens. "Food court, concourse, anchor stores, most of the shop entrances. Some of the cameras in the smaller stores are dead, budget cuts, but the important stuff is covered." He handed me a clipboard with a patrol sheet. "Every hour, you walk the route marked on this map. Check all the exterior doors, look for broken windows, general security stuff. Initial each checkpoint and note the time. Radios set to channel 7. That's our dispatch. You probably won't need it, but policy says check in every 4 hours." I studied the patrol route. It was a circuit that took you through all the main areas of the mall, including the food court, both anchor stores, and the administrative offices on the second level. Estimated time, 45 minutes if you didn't rush. "What about the stores themselves?" I asked. "Do I need to check inside them?" Carl shook his head. "Most are locked and empty. The few that still have merchandise are sealed by court order, bankruptcy stuff. You're just looking for obvious problems. Broken glass, graffiti, people who shouldn't be here. He showed me around the mall for my first patrol. Walking through Eastgate at night was surreal. The corridors that had once buzzed with shoppers and conversation were silent, except for our footsteps echoing off the tile floors. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, creating long shadows between the empty storefronts. Most of the stores were dark, their security gates pulled down over entrances that still displayed faded store closing signs. A few had been completely stripped, leaving bare concrete spaces that looked like missing teeth in a smile. Others still had mannequins in the windows, their plastic faces staring out at nothing. The food court was the strangest part. 8 restaurant spaces arranged in a semicircle around a seating area that could accommodate maybe 200 people. The tables and chairs were still there, though many were stacked or pushed against walls. Each restaurant space was secured with metal grating, but you could still see inside. Empty prep areas, defunct fryer stations, cash registers with their drawers hanging open. This part gives some people the creeps, Carl admitted as we walked through the seating area. Something about all those empty restaurants, but it's just space, you know. Nothing to worry about. I nodded, but he was right about the creepy factor. There was something unsettling about a place designed to feed hundreds of people sitting completely empty. The silence felt wrong, like walking through a concert hall between performances. We finished the patrol without incident. Carl showed me how to log the checkpoint times, how to use the radio, and where the first aid kit was located. By midnight, he was ready to leave. "Any questions?" he asked, gathering his jacket and lunch bag. "How long have you been working here?" "About 2 years, since right after it closed. Boring as hell, but the money's decent and nobody bothers you." He paused at the door. "Oh, one thing. Sometimes the motion sensors get triggered by temperature changes or old equipment cycling on and off. Don't worry about it unless you see something obvious on the cameras." Then he was gone, and I was alone in 37 acres of abandoned retail space. My first solo shift passed quietly. I settled into the security office and watched the camera feeds, getting familiar with the layout. Most of the cameras showed exactly what you'd expect: empty corridors, vacant storefronts, the occasional mouse scurrying across the floor. The food court cameras showed the rows of empty tables and the darkened restaurant spaces beyond. Every hour, I did my patrol. The route took me through the main concourse, past the dead fountain with its stagnant water, up the stairs to the administrative offices, through both anchor stores and finally through the food court, before returning to the security office. It was monotonous but not unpleasant. I'd brought a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel, and the time passed easily enough. The second night was similar, though I started to notice small details I'd missed before. The way sound carried differently in the empty spaces. My footsteps seemed to echo longer than they should. The occasional creak or groan from the building settling. The hum of HVAC equipment that still ran to prevent mold and maintain minimum temperatures. It was during my third night that I first noticed something odd. I was in the security office around 2 a.m., watching the monitors and reading, when movement on the food court camera caught my eye. It was subtle, just a brief shadow crossing the seating area near the old Panda Express. I rewound the digital feed and watched it again. There it was, lasting maybe 2 seconds, something moving from right to left across the bottom of the frame. I checked the other food court cameras, but they showed the usual empty tables and darkened restaurants. The motion sensors hadn't triggered, and there were no alarms. Probably just what Carl had mentioned, old equipment or temperature changes creating false images. But it bothered me enough that when I did my 2 a.m. patrol, I paid extra attention to the food court. Everything looked normal. Empty tables, security grating over the restaurant entrances, emergency lighting casting the same sickly shadows it always did. I made note of the time and continued my rounds. The shadow appeared again, the next night and the night after that, always on the same camera, always lasting just a few seconds, always moving in the same direction. I started watching for it, checking the timestamp. It happened at different times, sometimes around 2, sometimes closer to 4, never exactly the same moment. By my second week, I was sure it was a camera malfunction. Digital artifacts were common in older surveillance systems, especially in buildings where the equipment had been installed years ago and then largely forgotten. I made a note to mention it to Davidson the next time I submitted my weekly report. That was when I noticed the sound. It happened during my 4 a.m. patrol on a Thursday night. I was walking through the food court, checking the perimeter doors, when I heard what sounded like conversation. Very faint, like people talking in the distance. I stopped and listened, but the sound faded almost immediately. Old buildings make noise. I knew that. Expansion and contraction, air moving through vents, even sound carrying from outside through gaps in the structure. But this had sounded distinctly like human voices coming from somewhere in the restaurant area. I approached the security grating over the old Sbarro space and listened carefully. Nothing. I tried the Pizza Hut, then the Chinese place, then the burger joint. All silent. But as I was walking away, I heard it again. A brief murmur of conversation, too indistinct to make out words, but definitely human. I stood in the center of the seating area and slowly turned in a circle, trying to identify the source. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere like an audio mirage. After 5 minutes of listening, I heard nothing more and continued my patrol. Back in the security office, I reviewed the food court cameras for the time I'd been there. The feeds showed me walking around, stopping to listen, but nothing else. No other movement, no obvious source for the voices I'd heard. I decided not to mention it in my report. New job, weird hours, stress from months of unemployment. It was entirely possible my mind was playing tricks on me. Better to wait and see if it happened again. It happened again the very next night. This time I was prepared. I'd brought a small flashlight in addition to the large security flashlight I carried on patrol. When I heard the voices during my 3 a.m. rounds, I immediately moved toward what seemed to be the source, the cluster of restaurants on the north side of the food court. The murmur of conversation was clearer this time. At least 2 people, maybe 3, talking in low tones. I could almost make out words, but not quite. It reminded me of listening to people talk in the next room through a thin wall. I knelt down near the security grating over the old Chinese restaurant and pointed my flashlight inside. The beam illuminated empty prep areas, a defunct cash register, chairs stacked on tables. Nothing unusual, but the voices continued, seeming to come from deeper inside the space. Most of the restaurants in the food court were relatively shallow, just enough room for food prep, a serving counter, and minimal seating. But some of them, particularly the anchor restaurants like the Chinese place and the burger joint, extended back further into the building. There could be storage areas, employee break rooms, even connecting passages between restaurants that I couldn't see from the front. I tried shining my light through the grating at different angles, looking for any sign of movement or occupation. The beam reached maybe 15 feet into the restaurant before being swallowed by darkness. The voices had stopped. Standing up, I walked to the burger joint next door and repeated the process. This restaurant was laid out differently, with the service counter at an angle that blocked my view of the back area. I could see empty fryer stations and a cold grill, but beyond that was darkness. As I was examining the space, I heard a new sound. Not voices this time, but something that sounded like footsteps on tile coming from inside the restaurant. I pressed my face against the security grating and listened intently. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, like someone walking slowly through the space. They seemed to move from the back of the restaurant toward the front, then stop. I waited, hardly breathing, but heard nothing more. I completed the rest of my patrol in a state of heightened alertness, checking every shadow and corner more carefully than usual. Back in the security office, I spent the remaining hours until dawn watching the food court cameras obsessively. The feeds showed the usual empty tables and darkened restaurants. Whatever I'd heard, the cameras weren't picking it up. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was acoustics. Empty buildings could carry sound in unexpected ways. Maybe there were maintenance workers in another part of the building, or traffic sounds from outside were being channeled through the ventilation system. The logical explanations were more comforting than the alternative. But when I arrived for my shift the next evening, I brought a digital voice recorder. The voices started earlier that night, around 1:30 a.m. I was doing my hourly patrol when I heard them coming from the food court. This time I was ready. I activated the voice recorder and held it near the security grating while listening to what sounded like multiple people having a conversation. The audio quality was poor and the voices were indistinct, but there was definitely something there. I recorded for about 3 minutes before the sounds faded. Back in the security office, I played back the recording through my phone's speaker. Static and background noise, but underneath it, unmistakably, the sound of human voices. I couldn't make out specific words, but the rhythm and cadence were clearly conversational. At one point, I even thought I heard laughter. I saved the recording and made detailed notes about the time and location. This was evidence of something, though I wasn't sure what. Maybe there were homeless people who'd found a way into the building and were hiding in areas I couldn't access. That would explain the voices and the movement I'd been seeing on camera. The thought was both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because it provided a rational explanation for what I'd been experiencing. Concerning because it meant there were unauthorized people in the building during my shift, which was exactly the kind of thing I was supposed to prevent. I decided to call the situation in to dispatch. Security to dispatch, channel 7. I said into the radio, nothing but static. I tried again, checking to make sure I was on the right channel. Security to dispatch, this is Eastgate Center, do you copy? More static. I tried different channels, checked the radio's battery level, even walked to different parts of the building in case it was a signal strength issue. Nothing worked. The radio seemed to be functioning normally. I could hear the background hiss that indicated it was receiving, but I couldn't reach dispatch. That was when I noticed something else odd. My cell phone, which usually got decent reception in the mall, was showing no bars. I walked to different areas of the building, including near windows and exterior doors, but couldn't get a signal anywhere. I found a landline phone in the administrative office and tried calling the emergency number Davidson had given me. The phone was dead. No dial tone, no connection. For the first time since starting the job, I felt genuinely uneasy. I was completely cut off from outside communication. Alone in a massive building where I was hearing voices and seeing movement that shouldn't exist. Every rational part of my mind said there was a logical explanation. Equipment problems, atmospheric interference, stress and isolation playing tricks on my perception. But the voices were real. I had them recorded. I spent the rest of the night in the security office, watching the monitors and listening for any sound from the food court. Around 4 a.m., I saw the shadow again on camera number 15. The same brief movement across the seating area, lasting just a few seconds. This time I was watching for it, and I was certain it wasn't a digital artifact. Something was moving in the food court. When my shift ended at 10 a.m., I drove straight home and listened to the recording again on my computer with better speakers. The quality was poor, but I could definitely hear multiple voices having some kind of conversation. I tried enhancing the audio with free software I downloaded, but couldn't make out specific words. I called Davidson's office and left a message about the communication problems. Then I tried to decide whether to mention the voices. On one hand, it was my job to report anything unusual. On the other hand, claiming to hear ghostly conversations in an abandoned mall wasn't exactly the kind of thing that would inspire confidence. In my professional judgment, I decided to investigate further before making any official reports. That evening, I arrived for my shift with additional equipment. Along with the voice recorder, I brought a better flashlight, a digital camera, and a small mirror I could use to see around corners. If there were people hiding in the restaurants, I was going to find evidence of them. The communication problems persisted. No radio contact with dispatch, no cell phone signal, no working landline. It was like the building existed in some kind of dead zone where electronic communication simply didn't function. I did my regular patrols for the first few hours, documenting everything normally and watching the monitors. Around midnight, I decided to focus specifically on the food court. The voices started just after 1 a.m., the same indistinct conversation I'd been hearing for the past week. This time, instead of just listening from the security grating, I decided to see if I could get a better view of the restaurant interiors. Most of the food court restaurants had security grating that covered the service counters, but didn't extend all the way to the ceiling. There was usually a gap of 3 or 4 feet between the top of the grating and the drop ceiling tiles. If I could get up high enough, I might be able to see over the grating into the back areas of the restaurants. I found a maintenance ladder in a storage closet and set it up near the old Pizza Hut. The voices seemed to be coming from that general area, though the acoustics made it hard to pinpoint exactly. I climbed up and shined my flashlight over the security. In the break area, I could see sleeping bags spread on the floor, plastic containers that looked like they contained food, a small camping stove, personal belongings scattered around the space. Someone had been living in the abandoned restaurant. I climbed down and moved the ladder to the Chinese restaurant next door. From above, I could see a similar setup, makeshift sleeping areas, supplies, evidence of long-term habitation. The voices had stopped, but it was clear I'd found the source. Moving systematically, I checked each restaurant from above. 3 of them showed signs of occupation: the Pizza Hut, the Chinese place, and the burger joint. The others appeared genuinely empty. As I was examining the burger restaurant, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps directly below me, inside the restaurant. Someone was moving around in the space I was looking down into. I turned off my flashlight immediately and tried to climb down the ladder as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking as I folded the ladder and carried it back to the storage closet. I'd found what I was looking for, but I wasn't prepared for a direct confrontation with whoever was living in the restaurants. Back in the security office, I tried to decide what to do. I had evidence that people were living in the building without authorization. That was clearly a security issue I needed to report. But my communications were still down, and I was alone with an unknown number of potentially hostile individuals. The smart thing would be to complete my shift without confronting anyone, then report everything to Davidson in the morning. But I was curious about who these people were and how they'd managed to set up living spaces in restaurants that were supposedly secured. I decided to try one more investigation, this time focusing on how they were getting in and out of the restaurants. The security grating over the service counters looked intact, but there had to be another access point. I took my flashlight and walked around the perimeter of the food court, looking for any obvious entry points. Most of the restaurants backed up against exterior walls or adjoining corridors, but a few shared back walls with storage areas or other restaurants. Behind the seating area, I found a service corridor that provided access to the restaurant's back areas for deliveries and maintenance. Most of the doors along this corridor were secured with deadbolts, but when I checked them systematically, I found one that was slightly ajar. The door opened into the storage area behind the Chinese restaurant. I could see the sleeping bags and supplies I'd spotted from above, but more importantly, I could see how the space connected to the other occupied restaurants through gaps in the walls where utilities had been removed. Someone had created a network of connected living spaces in the backs of the restaurants, accessible through the service corridor. They'd been living here for who knows how long, completely hidden from casual observation. As I stood in the doorway, taking in the scope of the setup, I heard voices again, much closer this time, coming from one of the connected spaces. I backed out of the doorway and eased the door closed, then retreated to the main food court area. The voices grew louder, and I realized whoever was in there was moving toward the service corridor. In a few minutes, they might discover that the door had been disturbed. I needed to get back to the security office and decide how to handle this situation. I made it about halfway across the food court before I heard the service door open behind me. I didn't turn around, but I could feel eyes watching me as I walked back toward the main concourse. My skin crawled with the sensation of being observed by unknown people who had been living secretly in the building where I worked alone 4 nights a week. In the security office, I locked the door and reviewed the food court cameras. They showed me walking through the seating area and leaving, but I couldn't see the service corridor from any of the camera angles. Whoever was back there remained invisible to the surveillance system. I spent the rest of the night planning my next move. I had evidence of unauthorized occupation, but no way to communicate with the outside world. I could abandon my post and drive to a location where my phone worked, but that would mean leaving the building unsecured and possibly allowing the occupants to relocate before authorities could investigate. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. How long had these people been living here? Were they homeless individuals who'd found creative shelter or something more organized? How had they gotten past the security measures, and why? Were my communications being blocked? That last question bothered me the most. The radio and phone problems could be coincidental, but the timing seemed suspicious. It was possible that whoever was living in the restaurants had some way of jamming communications to prevent discovery. When my shift ended at 10 a.m., I made a decision. I would report everything to Davidson immediately and recommend that police investigate the situation. Whatever was happening in the food court, it was beyond my ability to handle alone. But when I tried calling Davidson's office from my car, I got a recorded message saying the number was no longer in service. I tried the main Sunset Properties number from the paperwork I'd signed. Also disconnected. I drove to the office building where I'd been interviewed but found it empty. The property management company's sign was gone from the directory, and the office space appeared to be vacant. For the first time, it occurred to me that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. I went home and researched Sunset Properties LLC online. I found a website, but it was generic and provided no real information about the company's operations or personnel. The address listed was a P.O. box. Phone numbers led to automated voicemail systems that never returned calls. Searching for information about Eastgate Shopping Center's ownership, I found conflicting records. Some sources listed it as owned by a bank after foreclosure. Others showed it as property of a development company. None mentioned Sunset Properties or security contracts. The more I investigated, the more it seemed like the job itself might be illegitimate. But I'd been paid for my first 2 weeks, real money that had cleared my bank account. Someone was paying me to work security at the mall, even if the company's identity was questionable. I decided to continue working my shifts while investigating further. If nothing else, I needed the money, and I was genuinely curious about who was living in the food court and what their story was. That night, I arrived at my shift with a different mindset. Instead of just documenting the presence of unauthorized occupants, I wanted to understand who they were and what they were doing. I brought a small notebook to record observations and a better camera for documentation. The voices started earlier than usual, around 11:30 p.m. But this time, instead of hiding and listening from a distance, I decided to try making contact. I walked to the service corridor behind the food court and knocked gently on the door I'd found unlocked the night before. The voices stopped immediately. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again. "Hello?" I called softly. "I'm the security guard here. I know you're in there and I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want to talk. Silence. I tried again. Look, I've been hearing you for over a week. I know you're living back there. I'm not going to call the police or anything. I just want to understand what's going on. After a long pause, I heard movement from inside. Then a voice, muffled by the door, but clearly human. Go away. I can't go away. I work here, but I'm not your enemy. Can we just talk for a minute? More silence. Then the sound of multiple voices conferring in whispers. Finally, the same voice as before. What do you want? I want to know how long you've been here and if you need help. The door opened about 6 inches, revealing a thin slice of a man's face. He appeared to be middle-aged, with unkempt hair and suspicious eyes. You're not supposed to be back here, he said. Neither are you, I replied. But here we are. He studied me for a moment, then opened the door wider. Behind him, I could see 2 other people, a woman about the same age and a younger man, maybe early 20s. We're not causing any trouble, the woman said. We just need a place to stay. I nodded. How long have you been here? About 6 months, the older man replied. Since right after they stopped the regular security patrols. That caught my attention. There were regular security patrols before me? The 3 exchanged glances. Different company, the woman explained. They had guards here for about 2 years after the mall closed. Then one day they just stopped coming. When did they stop? Maybe 2 months ago. We thought security was done for good, then you showed up. I was starting to get a clearer picture. These people had been living in the abandoned restaurants for months, avoiding detection by hiding whenever security was present. When the previous security company's contract ended, they'd had the building to themselves until I was hired. What happened to the previous security company? I asked. The younger man spoke for the first time. They didn't say anything to you about taking over from another company? No. I was told this was a new contract for insurance purposes. More glances between the 3. The older man stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. The space was more elaborate than I'd realized from my brief glimpse the night before. They'd created a complex living area that extended through the back sections of 3 restaurants, connected by openings they'd carefully cut through. We're not vandals, the woman said defensively. We haven't damaged anything structural. When we leave, we can patch the wall openings and you'd never know we were here. Why here? I asked. Why not a homeless shelter or transitional housing? The older man, who'd introduced himself as Frank, laughed bitterly. You ever been to the shelters in this city? Waiting lists, time limits, rules about what you can and can't have with you. This place has everything we need: shelter, electricity, running water, and nobody bothering us. The woman, Linda, added, We all worked retail for years. I managed a clothing store, Frank worked electronics, Danny here was in food service. When the economy tanked and the stores closed, we couldn't find anything else. This feels like home, in a weird way. Danny, the younger man, was clearly the technical expert of the group. He'd figured out how to tap into the building's utilities without triggering any alarms, and he'd set up their electrical systems safely. What about food? I asked. Dumpsters behind grocery stores, Frank said. Amazing what gets thrown away. Plus, Linda gets food stamps, and I collect cans for recycling money. It was a comprehensive survival strategy. They'd created a sustainable living situation in a space that was effectively invisible to the outside world. I found myself impressed by their resourcefulness, even though they were technically trespassing. So what now? Linda asked. Are you going to report us? I considered the question. These were people who'd fallen through the cracks of society, finding creative solutions to homelessness in a building that was otherwise serving no purpose. They weren't causing damage or threatening anyone. In many ways, they were the perfect tenants for an abandoned mall, present but invisible. I don't know, I said honestly. I need to think about this, Frank nodded. We understand. Just give us a chance to disappear if you decide to turn us in. We don't want trouble. I promised to let them know before taking any action and returned to the security office. For the rest of the night, I grappled with the ethical implications of what I'd discovered. From a purely professional standpoint, I should report the unauthorized occupants immediately. That was clearly my job responsibility. But from a human standpoint, these were people who'd found a harmless way to survive difficult circumstances. Reporting them would likely result in their arrest and the destruction of the only stable housing situation they'd managed to create. There was also the question of my own employment situation. If Sunset Properties wasn't a legitimate company, was I even really a security guard? Was there actually an insurance requirement for security at the mall, or was I being paid to provide some other service? The more I thought about it, the more I suspected that my job existed specifically to monitor the building's unauthorized occupants. Someone knew about Frank, Linda, and Danny and wanted them watched rather than removed. But who and why, I decided, to dig deeper into the history of the mall and my employment before making any decisions about reporting the residents. The next day, I visited the city planning office and researched the property records for Eastgate Shopping Center. The ownership trail was complex, but I eventually traced it to a holding company that specialized in distressed commercial real estate. They'd acquired the mall through foreclosure and were apparently holding it while trying to find a buyer or redevelopment opportunity. More interesting was what I learned about the previous security company. Garrison Security Services had held the contract for 2 years before abruptly terminating their services. When I looked up Garrison online, I found they'd gone out of business around the same time they stopped providing security at the mall. I tried calling the holding company that owned the mall, but was told that security arrangements were handled by a third-party management firm. When I asked for contact information for that firm, I was given a number that led to the same kind of generic voicemail system I'd encountered with Sunset Properties. Everything about my employment situation seemed designed to obscure the real chain of command and responsibility. That evening, I arrived at work with a new theory. Someone wanted the building monitored, but not secured. They needed to know what was happening inside without interfering with whatever was taking place. My job wasn't to prevent unauthorized access. It was to observe and report. But report to whom I decided to test my theory by being more systematic about my documentation. Instead of just noting the presence of voices and movement, I would create detailed logs of who was where and when. If someone was paying me to monitor the building's inhabitants, they would want comprehensive information. Over the next week, I established a routine of checking in with Frank, Linda, and Danny during my shifts. They were initially wary, but gradually became more comfortable with my presence. I learned their daily schedules, their survival strategies, and their long-term plans. Frank was a former electronics store manager who'd lost his job when the big box retailers moved into the area. He'd been unemployed for over 2 years before, giving up on finding traditional work. He was the group's leader and decision-maker. Linda had managed a women's clothing store for 15 years before it closed. She was the most organized of the three, maintaining schedules and managing their limited resources. She also handled interactions with social services and tried to keep up appearances for any official contacts. Danny was the youngest and had been homeless the longest. He'd aged out of the foster care system and worked various food service jobs before ending up on the streets. He was brilliant with electronics and had essentially engineered their entire hidden living situation. All three were intelligent, resourceful, people who'd been failed by economic and social systems rather than personal shortcomings. They'd created a stable micro-community in the abandoned mall, complete with shared responsibilities and mutual support. As I got to know them better, I became increasingly reluctant to do anything that might disrupt their situation. They weren't hurting anyone, they weren't damaging property, and they'd found a way to survive with dignity in circumstances that had left many others on the streets. But I still had a job to do, even if I wasn't entirely sure what that job really entailed. My breakthrough came during my third week of employment. I was reviewing my patrol logs when I noticed a pattern in my own behavior. I'd been unconsciously documenting the residents' activities in detail, noting when they were present, what areas they used, how they moved through the building. My logs read less like security reports and more like surveillance notes. Someone was definitely using me to gather intelligence about the building's unauthorized occupants. To test this theory, I started including even more detailed information in my reports. I noted specific times when each resident was active, described their apparent health and mental states, and documented their resource-gathering activities. If someone was reading these reports for surveillance purposes, the additional detail would be valuable. 2 days later, I received my first direct contact from my actual employer. A text message appeared on my phone during my shift. Excellent work. Continue current protocols. Bonus payment authorized. The message came from a number I didn't recognize, and when I tried calling it back, I got a recording saying the number was not in service. But my next paycheck included an extra $500, confirming that someone was indeed monitoring my work and approving of my detailed surveillance. This changed everything. I wasn't a security guard in any traditional sense. I was an undercover observer, paid to monitor people who had no idea they were being watched. The ethical implications made me sick to my stomach. Frank, Linda, and Danny trusted me. They'd welcomed me into their hidden community, shared their stories, and treated me as a friend rather than a threat. Meanwhile, I was documenting their every move for some unknown authority who was paying me to spy on them. I had to make a choice. Continue collecting my surveillance paycheck while betraying people who'd shown me nothing but kindness, or find a way to protect them from whatever was coming. I chose protection. The next night, I arrived at work with a different plan. Instead of my usual check-in with the residents, I spent time studying the building's layout and security systems more carefully. If I was going to help Frank, Linda, and Danny, I needed to understand exactly how they were being monitored and by whom. The camera system was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. While most of the feeds showed standard security footage, a few cameras had capabilities that seemed beyond normal retail security needs. Enhanced night vision, motion tracking, even what appeared to be facial recognition software running in the background. More disturbing was what I found when I examined the cameras in the food court area. They were positioned to have clear sight, lines into the restaurant spaces, but the angles suggested they'd been adjusted recently. Someone had specifically configured the surveillance system to monitor the areas where the residents lived. I also discovered that my computer terminal in the security office was uploading data to an external server every night. Not just my written reports, but camera footage, audio recordings from the building's PA system, and detailed logs of movement throughout the mall. Someone had turned Eastgate Shopping Center into a comprehensive surveillance operation, with me as an unwitting field agent gathering intelligence on 3 homeless. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. Frank, Linda, and Danny weren't just being monitored. They were test subjects in some kind of social experiment. The correspondence referenced controlled environment, behavioral modification, and long-term observation of adaptive strategies in artificial scarcity conditions. Someone was using 3 homeless people as laboratory rats, studying how they survived and adapted in a controlled environment. The abandoned mall wasn't shelter, they'd found. It was a maze they'd been placed in. I printed out everything I could access and stuffed the papers into my jacket. Then I went to find the residents and tell them what I'd discovered. I found them in their usual evening spot, the converted break area in the old Chinese restaurant. They were playing cards by lamplight, looking relaxed and comfortable in their hidden home. "We need to talk," I said, and something in my voice made all 3 of them look up with concern. I explained everything. The surveillance system, the data collection, the experimental language in the files I'd found. I showed them the printed correspondence that referred to them as test subjects. The silence that followed was devastating. Frank was the first to speak, his voice hollow. "How long have you known?" "I started figuring it out about a week ago. I've been trying to confirm it before saying anything." Linda stood up abruptly and began pacing. "So this whole time, everything we've done, everything we've built here, it's all been an experiment?" "It looks that way. I'm sorry, I had no idea when I took the job." Danny, who'd been silent, finally looked up from the table. "The previous security guards, did they know?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe they figured it out, and that's why the company was replaced." Frank rubbed his face with both hands. 6 months. 6 months we've been living like animals in a zoo, thinking we were free. The betrayal in their eyes was almost unbearable. These people had survived every form of social and economic abandonment, only to discover that their hard-won independence was itself a lie. "What do we do now?" Linda asked. "We get you out of here," I said. "Tonight, before whoever's running this experiment decides to escalate to the next phase." But even as I said it, I realized we might already be too late. The lights in the restaurant area flickered once, then went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in that familiar, sickly yellow glow. From somewhere in the building came the sound of multiple footsteps and voices. Not the residents. These were new voices, official-sounding, coordinated. "They're here," Frank said quietly. We could hear the footsteps getting closer, moving through the main concourse toward the food court. There were several people, possibly more than several, and they were searching the building systematically. "Is there another way out?" I whispered. Danny nodded toward the back wall. "Service tunnel that connects to the loading dock. But if they know about this place, they probably know about that too." The voices were in the food court now. We could hear them talking about search patterns and containment protocols. Whatever was happening, it was organized and professional. "We have to try," Linda said. "I'm not going back to being a lab rat." We gathered the most essential items we could carry quickly and moved toward the back of the restaurant complex. Danny led us through the makeshift passages he'd created between the different spaces, moving as quietly as possible. The service tunnel was narrow and dark, running behind all the food court restaurants toward the loading dock area. We'd made it about halfway when we heard voices behind us. "Movement in Sector 7. Subjects are mobile. They were tracking us somehow. Probably motion sensors or cameras I hadn't discovered during my investigation." We reached the loading dock area, but as Danny had predicted, there were people waiting outside. Through the dock windows, we could see several vehicles and what looked like security personnel. "We're trapped," Frank said, but I had an idea. "The anchor stores," I said. "They have their own entrances separate from the main mall. If we can get to the old Sears, there might be a way out that they haven't covered." It meant crossing through the main concourse, where we'd be visible to anyone searching the mall. But it was our only option. We backtracked through the service tunnel and emerged near the administrative offices. From there, we could access the concourse level and make our way to the anchor store. The mall felt different now. What had been a familiar, even comfortable space during my weeks of security, patrols now felt hostile and threatening. Every shadow could hide surveillance equipment or searchers. We moved in single file, using the storefronts for cover, working our way toward the old Sears. Behind us, we could hear voices and footsteps as the search team worked through the food court area. "There," Linda whispered, pointing to the entrance to the anchor store. The Sears had been empty for over 2 years, longer than the rest of the mall. Most of the interior fixtures had been removed, leaving a vast, echoing space filled with empty shelving and abandoned display cases. More importantly, it had multiple exits: the main entrance to the mall, a side entrance to the parking lot, and a service entrance near the stockroom. We tried the service entrance first, but found it chained and locked from the outside. The side entrance was our best bet, but as we approached it, we could see vehicles parked outside with people moving around them. "They've got us surrounded," Danny said. That's when we heard footsteps behind us in the store. The search team had followed us into the Sears. We were out of options and out of time. "Listen," I said quietly. "I'm going to go talk to them. You three hide back in the stockroom and wait for my signal." "What signal?" Frank asked. "If I can get them focused on me, maybe you can slip out through one of the other exits." "That's suicide," Linda protested. "It's the best chance we have." Before they could argue further, I walked toward the front of the store where the voices were coming from. "Hello?" I called out. "This is the security guard. I'm unarmed and I'm coming out." 3 people in dark clothing emerged from behind a display case. They didn't look like police or security guards, more like corporate investigators or private contractors. "Where are the subjects?" the leader asked without preamble. "What subjects?" "Don't play games. We know you've been in contact with the test subjects. Where are they?" I kept my expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just—" "The night security guard." The man stepped closer. "We have recordings of your conversations with them, video of you entering their living areas. You've compromised a very important and expensive research project." "Research project?" "Social adaptation study. Behavioral modification under controlled conditions. 3 years of preparation and 6 months of data collection, all potentially invalidated because you decided to play social worker. 3 years of preparation. This went much deeper than I'd realized." "You want to know where they are?" I said. "They're gone. I helped them leave the building 2 hours ago. Your experiment is over." It was a lie, but I hoped it would buy the residents time to escape. The man's expression darkened. "That's unfortunate, for all of you." He gestured to his companions who started moving toward the back of the store. They knew I was lying. I had to do something to stop them. "Wait," I called out. "I'll make you a deal." The man paused. "What kind of deal?" "I'll tell you everything I know about their routines, their hiding places, their plans. In exchange, you let them go and forget about the experiment." "You're not in a position to negotiate." "Sure I am. You need me to testify that your research was legitimate, that the subjects were willing participants. Without my cooperation, you've got nothing but surveillance footage of people living in an abandoned building." He considered this. "Go on." "Those 3 people aren't criminals or test subjects. They're human beings who found a way to survive when society failed them. Whatever you're trying to prove with your experiment, it's not worth destroying their lives. You have no idea what we're trying to prove." "Then explain it to me." The man checked his watch, clearly weighing his options. "Fine. You want to understand? The subjects represent a specific demographic. Displaced retail workers with above-average intelligence and technical skills. We're studying how quickly they adapt to post-economic collapse conditions and what survival strategies they develop. Post-economic collapse. The retail sector is dying. Malls, department stores, traditional shopping districts, all becoming obsolete. We're trying to understand what happens to the millions of workers when that economic foundation disappears entirely. By trapping people in an abandoned mall and watching them like animals. By providing a controlled environment where they can develop adaptive strategies without external interference. The subjects have thrived here. They've created sustainable living conditions, established social structures, developed resource acquisition methods. They're proving that displaced populations can successfully transition to post-retail economic models. It was insane, but there was a cold logic to it. Someone was using Frank, Linda, and Danny as a prototype for how to manage mass economic displacement. And, after your study is complete, what happens to them then? They'll be relocated to a larger facility where they can help train other displaced populations in the survival strategies they've developed. You mean they'll become permanent test subjects? They'll become consultants in humanity's next economic phase. I'm sorry, I told them as they passed. Frank met my eyes. You tried. That's more than anyone else has done for us in a long time. The research team leader looked satisfied. The subjects will be transferred to the secondary facility tonight. You'll be coming with us to provide a complete debrief on your observations. And if I refuse, you won't refuse. You've seen too much to simply walk away, and you care too much about the subjects to abandon them now. He was right. I couldn't just go home and pretend none of this had happened. As we walked toward the exit, I took one last look around the abandoned mall. In a few hours, it would be empty again, waiting for the next group of desperate people to discover its hidden possibilities. The experiment would continue, just with different subjects and a new security guard who didn't know what he was really being paid to observe. The whole thing was a machine for processing human desperation, disguised as retail space. Outside, several black SUVs waited in the parking lot. Frank, Linda, and Danny were loaded into one vehicle while I was directed to another. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Debriefing facility first, then the secondary research site. You'll find it quite interesting. We're scaling up the program significantly." As we drove away from Eastgate Shopping Center, I watched the building disappear in the darkness behind us. Somewhere in the city, other abandoned retail spaces were probably being prepared for new experiments. Other displaced workers were being selected as subjects. Other security guards were being hired to watch and document the slow collapse of the world they'd known. The last thing I saw before we reached the highway was a for lease sign in front of another dead shopping plaza. Die experiment was expanding.